They will never let a black man be Captain America. And even if they did, no self-respecting black man would ever want to be.
Don't act like I'm average, you want me home.
Hi everyone, I'm Dom Griffin, I'm a film critic and you're watching the Armchair Auteur. This is an ongoing video series I do where we talk about old movies, new movies, screenplay analysis, television reviews, that sort of thing. So if you like movies and pop culture and you like to see somebody pick those things apart, please consider subscribing. Today we're going to do sort of a post-mortem on The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. The Disney Plus MCU series just concluded this past week. I have already done a video about the show's first episode when it came out, and I'm kind of trying to make an effort to do more follow-up type videos on the channel. So like, if I start something that's like an episodic thing and I pass judgment on it prematurely, I want to try to be able to come back and like talk about it once it's over, at least once the season's over, so I can share like my updated thoughts. Generally, like if I don't have a lot to say for a whole video, I'll just like go on Twitter and like just tweet about it, which I sort of did with the show, but after like 10 minutes of tweeting about it, I realized I had more thoughts than I should just throw out unprocessed onto the social media platform that I hate, but I'm not leaving anytime soon because I'm an idiot. So that's what this video is for. We're just going to talk about the show. Generally, there's going to be spoilers because I'm assuming if you're watching this, you've already seen it. It's like a big monoculture thing. I assume people have already watched it. And I'm just going to talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, and what I think it means for the MCU going forward. What I did like. I want to get out of the way that I did, for the most part, enjoy the show more than I thought I would in my initial video. It's a mixed bag and less consistently entertaining than WandaVision was to me, but it wasn't the complete failure or waste of time I was concerned it would devolve into by the finale. But we'll get into my feelings on the finale in a bit. Overall, what I liked most about this show was when it embraced its vibe as the kind of random little miniseries Marvel regularly publishes with side characters deemed unimportant enough to sustain their own ongoing title. And given how the MCU has long suffered by not filling in the blanks between movies and further developing its smorgasbord of background players, I can't fault them for rectifying this, even if the results so far are pretty shaky. But my main love for the series comes from three characters. John Walker, a far more fascinating and layered antagonist than he's basically ever been in the comics, even the excellent work Mark Gruenwald did that honestly made him entirely too easy a heel. Baron Zemo, who was always a fave of mine from Civil War, but seeing Daniel Bruhl stretch out here, goof around as the cast's new Vegeta meets Phantom X stand-in was delightful. And Isaiah Bradley, a worthy character to bring in from the comics, done true justice by Carl Lumbly, despite the show using him for like 2 scenes and moving on. The most fun parts of this very all-over-the-place series were the ones that felt the most like a Marvel Knights book from the late 90s, following around some gray area characters doing cool spy shit in places like Madripoor as an excursion away from the mainstream viewpoint of most MCU products. They even had John Wick creator Derek Kolstad writing 2 of the middle episodes to give it that pulpier neo-noir flavor, which I felt was very much needed. If I'm being honest, I would have loved for the 6-episode series to be condensed into a standalone movie that hewed closest to the vibe and aesthetic of those 2 episodes, even though we would have had to lose a lot of ancillary stuff to make that work. But given how much of a slog the first 2 episodes were, I can't say I'd mind much. I will also say I liked most of the action. The opening episode's introductory set piece and most of the hand-to-hand combat fights felt the closest to being as good as the boat infiltration scene from The Winter Soldier, even if literally all of the action in the finale looked like dog shit by comparison. Kara Skoglund was clearly going for it throughout the show and wanted to maintain the Cap Trilogy's track record of largely solid to good fight choreography and action filmmaking. And for the most part, I think she succeeded. Okay, we've been sufficiently positive, now it's time to get negative. The finale did look like absolute dog shit, and it felt like the editing and staging and everything else just fell apart. I will say I do think a good amount of the blame for it looking and feeling this way can be accurately attributed to Sam's new suit. In the end of the show, once Sam fully embraces the shield and he shows up in the new Cap costume the Wakandans designed for him, I kinda wanted to laugh. I think it looks fine in production stills, and I applaud them for going with something a little more comics accurate, because I do think having brighter, more colorful costumes in comic book movies is fun. But this costume makes no sense for MCU Sam. The look Sam had in the comics for his brief tenure as Captain America made sense because it was based on his iconic outfit as the Falcon. In the MCU, Sam doesn't have an iconic look to iterate upon, so it honestly feels like Wakanda is just mocking his dumbass for taking up the shield of an imperialist nation that doesn't give a flying fuck about him by making as much of his body covered in the color white as humanly possible. It doesn't fully fit into the muted, semi-realistic take the Cap films have operated in since Winter Soldier, and while I do think more of these movies should be like the first Avenger, it still felt out of place. But the primary thing I didn't like about the show, and the finale specifically, are its messy politics. Before anyone starts up in the comments talking about why it's silly of me to critique the politics of a superhero television series produced by Disney, I just want to say, shut the fuck up. Second of all, this is a show whose creators paid a lot of lip service in interviews to the idea of presenting a more thoroughly thought out and progressive show within the MCU landscape, so they invited this sort of critique and observation their damn selves. Before I actually watched the finale, I saw the clip on Twitter of Sam talking to the GRC about the crusade Carly and the Flag Smashers embarked upon, and someone had screen capped a bit of him telling them how they controlled the banks and all that stuff, and I thought maybe for a brief moment, just maybe, the finale of the show would really go there, you know? But going into the finale and its reliable demonization of leftist politics, I already knew Carly, like Killmonger before her, was going to die in the show because the villains of the series who make the most sense, her, Killmonger, the Vulture, the ones whose perspectives are the most relatable, get very easily shunted off in favor of redeeming other sorts of villains and giving them their own shows. But to have this girl, whose entire arc was essentially nuked, like Killmonger's was, with the necessary amount of wanton violence to keep her far enough away from the prospect of redemption, die in the same show where a character like John Walker, who again, I must admit I genuinely enjoyed watching, gets to live for future spin-off material, was pretty frustrating. But the main reason it felt so frustrating was because it comes hot on the heels of Sam sitting and listening to Isaiah's story and deciding to become Captain America anyway. It's another story of a revolutionary trying to improve things for people being replaced by someone more respectable who is going to change things with words in a way the revolutionary couldn't accomplish with actions. And while the show's themes regarding the aftermath of the blip feel more interesting and fascinating in the light of our never-ending COVID year, choosing to end the show with your hero cutting a promo on some world leaders and moving them with the verbal equivalent of a stern letter just felt naive and misguided.
It was like the part in the movies when the hero shows up at the end to get his hard-earned medal and all his enemies in the crowd start to shrug off their grudges as they crack slow smiles.
Particularly given that the show's two leads, Sam and Bucky, never feel like people I truly care that much about. So seeing them reconcile, become partners, and then see Sam step into Steve's shoes feels strangely anticlimactic. I'll cop to the fact that I find MCU Sam more compelling than comic Sam, but given how boring I find comic Sam, that's a low bar to clear. There's just something so aggravating about watching a big climax of a superhero just talking to some people because of how poorly it fits into the way the MCU has codified superheroism. Like, okay, I can see Chris Evans as Steve Rogers selling a scene like that, because for the most part, MCU Rogers was written in a way that perfectly blended with Evans' stellar take on the character. But the show presented us two Captain Americas. One, written with nuance and played by a hungry and charismatic performer who fans immediately hated by virtue of him not being Steve Rogers, fueled almost entirely by self-fulfilling prophecy cringe memes about him being racist and several other criticisms that barely exist in the text, and another Captain America played by a also very talented and charismatic performer who isn't written with as much nuance or intrigue, who fans can immediately get behind by virtue of him not being the evil Captain America who doesn't use seasoning or whatever. Sam becoming Cap seems to work on screen because we're happy to have a black Captain America, even if we just watched a show about how fucked America is and how maybe he didn't need to pick up this goofy-ass shield at all. And so much of that is because, for all its standing as the aspirational alternative to the scare quote grimdark DCEU of Zack Snyder, the MCU's version of superheroism is largely inspired by Mark Miller and Brian Hitch's work on The Ultimates, a strange and, at the time, daring post-9/11, post-The Authority take on the Avengers that brought the super team into the new millennium kicking and screaming with tactical character designs and controversial Bush-era politics. They kept the costumes, Sam Jackson's face, and the general aesthetic, but barely dealt with the carryover notion of the superhero as an apparatus of the military and not a freestanding source of hope for an oppressed people. They kept the flesh and hoped the musculature bound beneath it would just magically disappear.
And you only move the headstones! You only move the headstones!
But even though I was annoyed by the end of the series and the finale and I wasn't jiving with it, I do still have some hope for the future of the MCU. They've already announced the development of a Captain America 4 starring Mackie as Sam with the shield from show creator Malcolm Spellman, and while whether or not I get excited depends on who else is brought in creatively, from a director standpoint, I have some hope that Sam's tenure as Cap will be so much better than it was in the comics. We often talk about how the MCU has become so much like the comics themselves, with its perpetual serialization, endless second acts, and constantly kicking the ball down the field to more and more sequels and spin-offs. But whenever Marvel has attempted to make serious changes to the iconography of its top-tier heroes, it's difficult for audiences to get invested because they know, sooner or later, those heroes are going to get replaced by their original counterparts. It's the Jeff Johns principle. It doesn't matter how much a major comics publisher race bends its biggest characters or passes their mantles to newer characters, some white dude in his 40s is going to insist it go back to how it was when he was a kid. And since all comic readers know this, they don't bother caring when they make Cap black or Thor a woman. They know it won't last. But the MCU is different. Chris Evans has other shit to do. There's no real reason for him to come back to being Cap. At the pace these movies move, Sam can be Captain America for like 10 more years, and it'd only be a handful of movie appearances. Sure, eventually Disney might quantum reset the entire MCU and recast all the originals with hotter and younger performers. That's
inevitable.
But in the meantime, they have the room to genuinely and drastically change the landscape within this world as dramatically as they want and not have to set the table back to its original setting in time for next summer's crossover event. This show showed they are capable of exploring a world that's heavily changed by new circumstances, but it remains to be seen how heavily the brand itself is willing to change. Because if they can avoid the pitfalls the Marvel Comics wing has of constantly returning to the same tired status quo, they might become as genuinely special as most audiences have convinced themselves they already are. And wouldn't that be nice to see? So yeah, those are my thoughts about The Falcon and Winter Soldier. Thought it was an okay show, not quite as good as WandaVision, could have been better, could have been worse. Some nice moments, but overall I keep being more and more annoyed about how the MCU has such a profound lock on the top spot. Like, they are the main event of popular culture, and they don't take more risks. And I want to see them take more risks because they can. Like, they can afford to. They can fuck around and like not really suffer for it. Because if they can't, then who else will? Hope you guys liked the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you have not subscribed, please subscribe. Hit the little bell icon to get notifications when I put out new videos. And if you have any thoughts about this, if you want to argue with me about imaginary superheroes, that's always fun to do. You can do so in the comments below. I like talking to you guys quite a bit. So thank you for watching. Hope everyone's staying safe, being good to yourselves and each other, wearing your masks, getting vaccinated if you can, and, just like being good, just chilling. Hope everyone's chilling, hope things are good. See you guys in the next one. Bye.